I'm Craig with Carshalton Advisory. This tutorial series covers the Excel 2016 Expert Curriculum. Download the linked file in the description. Let's work through things together as we review Section 1-2, Manage Workbook Review. Let's get started. With your workbook open, the first thing we're going to go through is how to restrict editing in a worksheet. And I can think of two good examples when we might want to use this particular feature in Excel. First off, and the example that we'll show you is, let's say that you have a workbook that you need to send to other users, and you would like them to enter data into particular cells, but then leave the rest of your formulas and formatting alone so that there aren't any errors introduced into the document. So you can restrict what the other user will have access to in order to protect you and the work that you've done. Another example that had been brought to my attention is, let's say you have an array with a bunch of constants or values that are important to the working of the rest of your model, and you don't accidentally want to overwrite them or introduce any kind of contamination to them. So you're effectively protecting yourself from yourself. So you could use protection, and that way you don't ever have to worry about accidentally overwriting something that you want to keep. So let's take a look at how we want to do this. So by default, all of the cells in a worksheet are pre-locked by Excel. So it's one of those things, if you want to keep things locked, you really don't have to make any changes. The trick comes when you want to unlock a cell, or so to give access to the cell once the protection has been turned on. So in this example, what we're going to do is we're going to go to cell Q7, all right, which is this cream colored cell. And so what we want to do is turn off the protection. So in order to do that, we're going to hit Control-1 on our keyboard, and we're going to hit P, which should take us over to protection. You're going to notice right up here at the top, it shows this toggle as locked. And so we're going to untoggle that. And if you notice underneath that L is an underscore, that means I can use my Alt key. So if I hit Alt L, I am now going to unlock this cell rather than leaving it locked. I'm also going to do it to this cell Q10. So we'll hit Control-1. We're already at protection, and I'll hit Alt-L in order to toggle it off. Enter shuts that window for me. So the next thing we need to do is turn on the protection. Because right now, we could go into any cell on this worksheet. If I just try and type something in, nothing's going to stop me. So let's turn on the protection for the sheet. We're going to hit Alt. Our protection is in the Review tab of our ribbon. So we can hit R in order to go to Review. And we want to protect the sheet. So that is P and S. And this is our Protect Sheet dialog box that's come up. So we'll go through a couple different options with this, but by default, only the first two are toggled on. And so what we're doing is we're allowing the users of this worksheet to do the following things. So they can select lock cells and they can select unlock cells. So they can select any cell, doesn't mean they can change them. They can only change the unlocked cells. So let's enter our password, and you can actually leave the password blank if you want it. So let's say, for example, we were setting up this array that we just didn't want to overwrite. Well, you don't even need to have a password. It'll still be protected, and you can just turn it back off really easily. So, but we'll set a password. You can use anything you want. Make sure you don't forget it. So in this case, let's just use the letter A. That's simple. Gives us a little bit of practice. We'll click OK. Excel wants to double check. We'll hit A again and OK. So now this sheet is protected. I can still click any cell in here, and you can do this on yours, but when you go to type, you get a different dialog box pop up saying, hey, you can't do that. So again, we can test all these cells, and they don't enter any data for us, unless we go to these cream input cells. So I always make sure I mark the cells that I want users to use as an input cell. And so, for example, here is our input cell. Let's try and enter a birth date. So we'll enter my birth date. It's 11/14, 1996. And so now the formula calculates how many days old I am. Okay, I'm not really that old, you know that. But this is how many days I would be, or how many days old I would be if I was born on that date. I would be 262 months or 21 years. So if you think that's my real birth date, I'm a pretty rough looking 21-year-old. So there is another unlocked cell on this, so we can enter our partner's birthday. So if you're wondering how much your difference in age exactly is, so let's say they are January 1st, 1997. So this tells how old they are, but basically the same age, just a few days and months different. And then at the bottom, this shows us exactly the difference between the two of them. So you'll notice if I click in these cells, I can actually see in the formula bar what the value, or excuse me, what the formulas are. If you click on these ones though, you can't see what I did there. Okay, so I'll show you that setting here really quick. So we're going to unlock this by going Alt R PS, and now we're going to type in our password again, in which case it was just the letter A, unless you chose something different. So now our sheet is unlocked, and this time what we're going to do is we're going to go, let's actually take a look at these cells here again. And what we'll do is going to go in and hit Control 1. And so you've noticed here, not only are they locked, but I've toggled the hidden button. So when the hidden button is toggled, you can't see the formula that's in the cell once the sheet is protected. So you may have reasons you want to do that. I just wanted to make sure that you had seen it both ways. We'll leave it as it is. We'll go back into protection. So that's Alt R, PS. And this time, what I'm going to do is uncheck the select locked cells. We'll use our same password and double enter it. So now what happens, if I try and click anywhere on this worksheet, nothing happens. So one, it does kind of protect any formulas if you don't want other people to know how you've created things. They can't actually click and select them. I couldn't click and copy the values either. The other reason I use this is just to make it a little bit easier for my users. So right now there's only 2 cells on this worksheet that they can access, and now they can just tab and it automatically goes between the cells. So if there's kind of 6 things I want someone to enter in, I might do this, and then that way they can type in their value, tab to the next one, type in their value, tab. It makes it quicker and easier for both of us. All right, let's take a look at our next task. The next thing we're going to look at is range protection. So we'll control page down to go to our next worksheet. Range protection works slightly different. The benefit of this is you can actually have a worksheet with different input areas and distribute it to a group, but only allow certain members of group to access one area and make changes, and different members to potentially access another. So let's start with this. So what we're going to do is we're going to go Alt R for review. We are going to go U1, which is allow edit ranges. And so what we can do is we can choose a new range, and we can name it. So let's call it constants. And I can either type in the reference, or I can actually highlight right on my worksheet what I want that to be and what the password's going to be. So in this case, let's just hit A again. All right, so now, oh, I already have that set up. So we'll call this constants 2 from when I practiced doing this. We'll click OK and double check that password. So now I have these 2 named sections. Now they're both the same in this case, but I could have one section over here, a different section over there. Once I have it done here, I can select who can edit it. And this way, I can actually search. If you're on a corporate network, you can actually search different members of that network and to allow them access. So let's click Add, and so you might, I might put Craig here, and then you could check the names. And sure enough, it found a user named Craig, so it's going to allow myself to use it, and then I could access those areas without using a password, but no one else would be able to. So it's kind of a neat feature to use. You do actually have to have protection turned on in order to allow that to happen. And otherwise, everyone will have access again. So it is somewhat related to the previous method. But again, the flexibility is that you can distribute the same sheet to different people, but only allow certain people access where everyone else is still locked out. Next, we're going to protect the workbook structure. So what this allows is, let's say you've distributed a worksheet and to another user, and they've taken your worksheet, and while you had your worksheets, they haven't been able to change it. They've added on a bunch of other worksheets afterwards. And maybe the stuff they've added in there you haven't approved or you haven't reviewed, or it doesn't look good, and so you don't want that being passed around with people thinking that it's work that you've done. So with workbook structure, you can actually prevent others from making those types of changes. So in this case, we're going to go Alt R to get into our review tab. This time we're going to hit PW for protect workbook. And we are going to type in our password. So in this case, we're going to protect the workbook for structure, which means that people are not going to be able to add or remove tabs to this workbook. They can't duplicate those types of things, so it's effectively locked down for us. And we'll enter another password. So now if I want to, well, you notice the add tab is grayed out, so it's not even an option for us anymore. If we want to F11 this to add new worksheets, it's not going to give us that capability anymore. I don't think it'll let us delete anything either. Yep, that's all grayed out. So it again adds an additional level of structure. You can actually set this up to protect window views so that people wouldn't be able to even scroll outside of the area that you have selected in the window. Next, we're going to take a look at a couple of the encryption capabilities that Excel has built in. Now, the built-in encryption is stronger than kind of the usual passwords that are available through the save as options tools command. And actually, I'll show you here that really quick. So if you go into F12, you can go into tools here at the bottom. Let me just make sure everyone can see this. So under tools, I can hit general options. And now I can set up a password that would, with a password, no one would be able to open the document without a password. However, it's not encrypted. So anyone with kind of like medium computer hacking skills would be able to get into that without much difficulty. Now, I often use this modify password so that when someone opens it up, if they don't have a password, all they can do is open up a copy. So they can still use it, but it protects my original. So what we'll show you next here, we'll cancel out of that, is the ability to provide a little bit more security. And so we're going to access this through Alt F to get into the backstage view, they call it. And then what we want to do is I for info and P for protect workbook. So now what we can do is we can select encrypt with a password here in the middle. Okay, and once we do this, okay, we would enter in a password, but now at this point, Excel or Microsoft takes a couple extra steps. So not only is it protected with the password, but they actually encrypt what's in it. So this provides, you're not going to protect yourself from a talented or extremely motivated person who wants access to your files, but it's gonna prevent kind of your average Joe from being able to get into documents that you don't want them to see. So again, treat it with a little bit of grain of salt. It provides a little bit more protection, but it's not going to be completely secure. The government would still be able to open that file. Or, with enough money, I'm sure you could hire someone who would get into it for you. Next, we'll take a look at how we can manage versions. So this is a handy process to have, and what it does is Excel continually saves backups, and by continually, not every second, but we can actually change how often that happens, and so that way, if you have a power failure or a blue screen or whatever else might happen, you're going to be able to not lose too much of your work. So we're going to go into the backstage view again to look at this. So we'll hit Alt F. We're going to go into T for options and S for save. There we go. So now we can take a look in here, and this shows us how often Excel is going to auto-save it. So right now I have mine set to 1 minute. Yours most likely is 10. But I usually end up somewhere around 5 minutes or so. So the trade-off, like space isn't a big deal for most people anymore. Hard drives are so large, running out of room isn't a problem. But what happens is every time it auto-saves, it takes some processing power on the computer's behalf. So if it's doing it every minute, you're going to notice you're going to be trying to work, and all of a sudden Excel's going to hang up for 5 seconds, maybe 10 seconds while it goes through the autosave routine. So every minute would probably drive you nuts, but every 5 to 10 minutes is probably not so much that you're going to be annoyed by it. So it shows us where it keeps the files. We'll click OK. And so now I know every 5 minutes, and you'll actually see down here in the status section, you'll notice, or maybe it's over here on the right, that every so often you'll see it say saving, and an indicator that it's taking a little bit of your processor time. But what the ability of this is, one reason is that if there's power failure or the computer fails, well, you haven't lost too much data. But I'll admit here, sometimes I start working on a document and I try something new and I get to a place where I've messed it up and I can't undo back far enough to prevent this problem from occurring. So what you can do is access a prior version through this system. So we're going to hit Alt-F to go into the backstage view. We're going to hit I for info, and then we will hit R for manage workbook, and let's browse these recent unsaved files. So now I can see actually right in the backstage view here that there are a few workbooks or a few previous versions already saved for me. So if I were to click on this, this would open up that version from a few hours ago or a couple hours ago. So it kind of lets you step back in a kind of a more extreme fashion. Now, I typically record new versions of my important workbooks on a daily basis. So if I needed to, I could always go back to yesterday's. And this system isn't going to maybe let you go back any time in the past. But if you need to go back an hour or two, it can be a very helpful capability that's built right in. And it's something that I've noticed a lot of Excel users don't know about and don't use properly. Lastly, we're going to look at the calculation options within Excel. So you have the ability to, by default, Excel, every time you hit enter, Excel calculates all the changed cells in your workbook. And it kind of takes a look around to see if anything's changed, and it's redone all the math. And on large spreadsheets, that can actually take a little bit of time. So every time you hit enter, you have to wait a second or two while all these processes are going on. So you can actually tell Excel whether you want to keep doing that automatically or not. You access this again through the backstage. We're going to hit Alt-F, T to go into options, and then we want to go into F for formulas. So you'll notice right here these calculation options. Right now mine is set to automatic, but I could switch it to manual. And so if I go to manual, and let's type a simple formula here. So we'll go 3, we'll go 6, and then I'll just do a sum function for those two values. So it's telling me 3 plus 6 is 9, but let's change this to 10. All right, so now it looks like 3 plus 10 is equal to 9, and we know that isn't correct. And that's because my calculations have been set to manual, so Excel doesn't automatically do it for us. So I can trigger a calculation a couple ways. One way I can do it is by selecting Calculate right here with my mouse. Okay, once I click that, Excel is going to process all the calculations in my workbook. The other thing I can do is I prefer using my keyboard when I can. If we hit F9 on our keyboard, as soon as I do that, that calculation is redone. So again, let's change this to 25. And of course, we're going to set these as input cells so that we always know where we want. Excuse me, I'm going to go into styles here. And there's my inputs. All right, so now this is set up as an input. I know which ones I want to use. Oh, and there's my old macro from last time. Equals sum. I have a different set of macros that I normally use, and so now my shortcuts are overlapping. So I've set up my inputs. Now when I change this, okay, again, nothing happens until I hit the F9 key. So there's one other way we can trigger a calculation, and that is when we save. So when you save it, it's going to do all your calculations before it saves your workbook. So let's go back into there. There's one other thing we want to take a look at. So Alt-F, T, and F for formulas, and that's iterative calculations. So if you have gotten circular references in your workbook before, this is what it's allowing to occur. Now, 80% of the time, probably 90% of the time, circular references are a problem and you want to avoid them if at all possible. But there are certain circumstances, and if I have a few workbooks where we use iterative calculations purposefully. And so in this case, I need to turn this capability on. Usually it's turned off by default. But what I can do is I can limit how many iterations it goes through. And I can do it two ways. One is just by a sheer number of iterations. After 100 iterations, it'll stop. The other thing I can do, though, is the maximum change. So the smaller this number is, let's see, the earlier it's going to stop calculating. So as soon as the change, excuse me, it's the opposite of that. So the bigger this maximum change is, the sooner your iterations are going to stop. And so basically what you're telling is with most iterations, every time it iterates, the magnitude of the change is less and less. And so it's important if you're going, say, from $1,000, still important if you're doing $100, still important maybe if you're doing $1, but by the time it's calculating tenths of a cent or hundredths of a cent difference from one iteration to another, you kind of just tell Excel like, okay, it really doesn't matter anymore. Let's stop this process so that it speed things up and we can get on to more productive things. So we'll click OK and our iterative calculations are on. So that's all the topics in this section. Make sure you do the practice tasks. While I appreciate you watching this video, if you want to pass the exam, you need to make sure you do the practice tasks. I do have videos that go through all of those. They're going to give you a little bit different taste of the same subject matter. Thanks for watching. Make sure if this has been valuable for you, give me a thumbs up. That not only gives me some positive reinforcement, but it also lets YouTube know that these videos are worth recommending to other users. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.